Hello and good day to everyone. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to present as part of this fascinating and engaging conference. I'd like to start off by saying a few words about what I actually do with the National Library of Israel, which is that I work with the Maktub digitization project. The goal of Maktub is to make the library's collection of over 2,500 Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts freely accessible and searchable online. The project, which is supported by a generous grant from Arcadia, a charitable fund of Lisbeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin, entails digitizing the library's entire Islamic manuscript collection, improving the manuscript's cataloging records and metadata, and building a new website for searching, viewing, and downloading the manuscripts. In addition, we're creating different kinds of content, articles, films, educational resources, maps, and more, for scholars, students, and the general public to engage with the collection. Like many Islamic manuscript collections, the National Library of Israel's manuscripts have eclectic origins. Now they're part of our Islam and Middle East collection, which is one of the library's 4 core collections, along with Judaica, Israel, and Humanities. The majority of the manuscripts, though, were actually acquired and donated by the scholar and collector, Abraham Shalom Yehuda. So let me just show you his picture now. Here it is. So born in 1877 in Jerusalem to a wealthy family, Yehuda was a precocious and wide-ranging scholar of Islamic and Jewish studies. He completed his academic training in Germany in 1905 and went on to teach in Berlin and Madrid before being offered a post at the newly established Hebrew University in 1920. Unfortunately, Yehuda, soon after he came to Jerusalem, left actually just a few months later because he had a disagreement with the Zionist leadership. He moved to London and stayed there until 1942, when he was appointed visiting professor at the New School in New York. Yehuda died in 1951. Now, Yehuda began collecting Islamic manuscripts systematically in the 1920s, traveling to Damascus, Lebanon, Cairo, and elsewhere to purchase materials. And here is just one example of one of the manuscripts that he purchased. It's one of the most beautiful ones in the collection, a 1484 copy of the Persian poet Jami's Tuhfat al-Ahrar, with the miniature you see is actually added later. So Yehuda sold manuscripts like these to the British Museum, to Irish-American collector Chester Beatty, the University of Michigan, Princeton, and other institutions. The 1,400 Yehuda manuscripts at the National Library of Israel were actually part of his own private collection. And they include, in addition to the nearly 1,200 Islamic manuscripts, Isaac Newton's theological writings, documents from the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt, and also his own personal papers. The manuscripts in the collection date from the 9th to the 19th century, were composed and copied throughout the Islamic world, and encompass all the major Islamic religious fields, as well as literature, science, medicine, and mathematics. The collection finally arrived at the library in 1967. Now, there are 2 additional groups of manuscripts that make up the remainder of the library's collection. The first group includes manuscripts that were donated to the library or acquired by it in a piecemeal manner over the course of its history. These 883 volumes, which are known collectively by the shelf mark MSAR, right, Manuscript Arabic, cover a similarly wide range of topics. Most were acquired on the recommendation of scholars working in different disciplines related to the study of Islam. The third group of manuscripts, which numbers 740 volumes, are part of the library's AP collection. AP stands for abandoned property. These manuscripts, this collection includes manuscripts as well as printed books and periodicals taken from Palestinian private homes and institutions during and after the 1948 war. While the detailed history of the AP materials remains unclear, the manuscripts were found primarily in Jerusalem and Haifa, and were deposited at the library for preservation and to enable scholarly access to them. Under Israeli law, the library is the custodian, not the owner of the AP materials. These manuscripts will also become available online as part of the Maktub project. In terms of their contents, the AP manuscripts date from the 13th to the 20th centuries, with the majority having been composed during the last 3 centuries, and they cover numerous Islamic as well as Christian topics. Just as eclectic as the manuscripts themselves, however, has been the history of their cataloging and reception. And that's the issue that I'd actually like to focus on in the time that remains to us. I'm especially interested in telling the story of how knowledge about the manuscripts in this collection was acquired, recorded, and preserved over the course of the past 5 decades, and asking the question of how that knowledge can and should be translated in the new digital platform that we're now in the middle of creating. There are more questions here than answers, I should say, especially at this early stage. But I believe and I hope that these questions are particularly productive and relevant beyond the specific instance of our own institution and this particular collection. So, as I mentioned, the Yehuda Manuscripts arrived in Israel in 1967, several years after Yehuda's own death, right, because there was a legal dispute over his bequest, and this dispute was ultimately resolved in the library's favor. In 1970, a few years later, Efraim Wust, then a student at the Hebrew University, was hired by the library to catalog the just arrived Yehuda collection. He had actually no prior experience working with Arabic manuscripts or in manuscript cataloging, and also almost no supervision over his work. So Wust devised his own cataloging system based on his autodidactic reading of the published catalogs of the great Oriental manuscript collections. Over the course of the next decade, he prepared a preliminary catalog of the entire Yehuda collection, right, 1,186 manuscripts. This was written out longhand in draft form, and the most essential information he transferred to a card catalog. On the basis of these cards, Wust compiled 6 indices: persons, titles, dates, first lines, and place names. For the next 15 years, as a result of staffing issues in the library, Wust actually left off his work on Islamic manuscripts to concentrate on materials in Hebrew and other Jewish languages. And then in 1986, Wust was given responsibility for cataloging the MSAR and AP collections as well, which he undertook using the same draft and card catalog system. During the course of his work, he also, and as he learned more just from working with these manuscripts and expanding his knowledge, he corrected his earlier draft catalog of the Yehuda collection, and actually using one of the first computers in the library, also created a word processor digital version of his Yehuda catalog. It was only another decade later, in 1997, that the draft version of that computerized catalog was first printed. And it was in a very, very limited edition of 17 copies, which was distributed to a select number of scholars in Israel and in Europe. These scholars' feedback, criticism, and encouragement was then incorporated into this experimental catalog, as was called it. The catalog actually didn't even cover the entire Yehuda collection. The last 30 or so manuscripts, which includes documents, illuminated manuscripts, fragments, and other materials that were more challenging to catalog, weren't included in the experimental collection, experimental catalog, I should say. During the following 20 years, until the publication by Brill of the first volume of the library's Yehuda catalog in 2017, Wust continued revising his work, making corrections and annotations to the card and word processor draft of the complete catalog. Now, in composing his catalog, Wust included the basic cataloging data that any manuscript catalog should have, right? Title, author, copyist, dates, a physical description of the manuscript, and extracts from the text, as well as bibliographical references. Throughout, he used a system of abbreviations of his own devising, and for manuscripts containing more than one composition, a collection that is, which is called in Arabic majmua, Wust devised his own system, which is actually not the standard, where he put all the compositions that make up the collection under the same shelf mark in one graphic block, as he put it. And I'll show you an example of what I mean in a second. Similarly, and unlike most manuscript catalogs, Wust did not organize the Yehuda manuscripts by subject, but rather just listed them by their shelf mark. So the catalog begins with Yehuda manuscript 1 and proceeds through 1186. A work on Islamic law can come just after a volume of Persian poetry and just before a treatise on astronomy. This lack of logical organization is actually really frustrating and can make it difficult to find what you're looking for, right? If you're searching, you want to find all the geographical manuscripts, you have to go to the index and flip back and forth. It's not very user-friendly. But there is a justification for using the system. When he was writing the catalog, Wust imagined that people would read it cover to cover, right? Like a novel or like a work of prose. And in so doing, readers would basically get, by the end, an advanced and intensive course in Islamic civilization. So in his eyes, the catalog he was composing was more like a scholarly manuscript than like a reference work. So another unique feature of the catalog is its language. Wust composes catalog in Arabic, even though he himself is not a native Arabic speaker. And this was a departure from the vast majority of catalogs of Islamic manuscript collections, which are written in European languages. As Wust explained in the author's introduction to the 2017 catalog, and here I'm just quoting, "As a resident of Jerusalem for more than 5 decades, I have been influenced by the presence of the Arabic language in all its dialects, sounds, and worlds. Therefore, I composed the description, as the obvious thing to do, in Arabic." There's more to this than just living in Jerusalem, though, right? Wust, in the catalog, was attempting to synthesize 2 different intellectual worlds. The first was the world of the Islamic bibliographic tradition, exemplified by the famous Fihrist, right, the book list of the 10th century scholar Ibn al-Nadim, or the 17th century Ottoman bibliographic encyclopedia by Haji Khalifa, known as Kashf Zanun, right, which was really one of Wust's models and the book that he returned to time and again in working on his catalog. So synthesizing that Islamic world and the world of German Orientalist scholarship. So whenever Arabic, scholarly Arabic, lacked a word for a concept or principle from the German tradition, Wust would simply make up his own, right? He would divine his own words. Now, just let me, for a second, show you what I mean. Here we go. So this is just a page from the PDF of the first volume of the catalog, published in 2017, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So here is Yehuda 223, right? This is in Arabic, as we can see. And what I'd like to demonstrate is just the kind of eclecticism and organization of the catalog. This is the entry for a work of poetry by the famous 17th century Arabic Sufi scholar and poet living in Damascus, Abd al-Ghani al-Nabulsi, with his information here, excerpts from the first lines, right? Previous owners, bibliographic references, and in the printed catalog, there's There's a brief synopsis in English, which of course was not in Wust's original version. So that is followed by, I'm sorry, 223 is followed by 224. Miftach al-Hisab, which is one of the most important mathematical works in the Islamic tradition by Kashi, which then, right, is followed by 225, a work on astronomy, right, followed by 226, a work on the Quranic sciences. Meaning there's the order that's given to the manuscripts is essentially the order of the shelf marks, which was determined by when they came out of the box, and Ephraim first cataloged them. So it's worth pausing at this point to consider Wust's work from a user or researcher's perspective. To put the point concisely, over the course of nearly 50 years, until his catalog began to be incorporated in the library's general computerized catalog, only in 2010, the only way to access the National Library of Israel's Islamic manuscripts was to make an appointment to talk to Ephraim. Physically, the word processor version of the catalog was saved on a file on Wust's own office computer, and the accompanying card catalog set next to his desk in the library's manuscript division. In order to browse the card file indices, one not only had to be fluent in Arabic and to be able to read Wust's handwriting, but one had to understand the numerous allusions, signs, ellipses, acronyms, and neologisms that comprise his own personal jargon. The Yehuda collection, because of its prominence and importance, was the obvious focus of Wust and the library's attention. That meant, however, that the other two collections, AP and MSAR, while fully cataloged, are less well known and less available for research. Now, in telling you all this, I'm not trying to disparage Efraim Wust, far from it, right? For those who had access to him, a group that included numerous Israeli, Palestinian, and international scholars, Wust was just really an unprecedented source of knowledge about the library's Islamic manuscripts and the Islamic book tradition more widely. He was incredibly generous and forthcoming with sharing his information and knowledge, at least with those whom he felt were worthy recipients. Rather than his written catalog standing alone, as it were, kind of after its birth, existing independently from its creator, we might say that the catalog in process served as an aide-de-memoire for Wust himself, to draw on his own vast stores of wisdom and experience. In other words, the most important catalog was the one contained and updated in his own mind, which was supported and reinforced by the various written card, paper, and computer versions. Now, why am I telling you this story? As we go about creating the digital portal for the new home online for the library's Islamic manuscripts, my thoughts often go back to Efraim Wust and to the model of knowledge that he represents, a model that is, I know, by no means restricted to our own institution, the singular scholar who serves as sole guide and gatekeeper, and who can help or hinder those seeking knowledge as he wishes. The difference between this figure and that of the open digital repository is far more than that between analog and digital ways of organizing knowledge. Instead, I think the difference lies in the distinction between personality and anonymity. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure, in fact, that those are quite the right terms we should be using. So, can we translate Wust's knowledge, and more than that, his personality, to the new platform? And if so, how do we do so? In order to make the collection as accessible as possible, there are a number of processes of translation that are necessary, right? The translation of the cataloging metadata from Arabic to English, so that users can search and explore the collection in that language as well. Also, the translation and expansion of Wust's own private and idiosyncratic language and notation into a standard version of academic Arabic that can be readily understood by any trained scholar. While these are more or less technical issues, though by no means minor ones, there's a greater challenge. we will seek to translate the web of connections between the collection's manuscripts, a knowledge acquired over decades of intense work and intimate familiarity that has really resided primarily in Wust's mind. Is there a digital means to replicate the role that Wust played as guide and gatekeeper? As I mentioned, this is not a question to which we have a clear answer, though it's certainly informing our decisions as we design the user experience and platform from Maktub. We want to make as many roads into the collection as we can, using all the tools of design, information architecture, and storytelling to allow users to find and make connections between different manuscripts in the collection. We're planning to incorporate interactive maps that indicate where manuscripts were composed and copied, to allow searching by numerous parameters, right? Not subject, date, author, codicological features, et cetera, a whole host of search options, and also to include essays on topics, authors, and themes that figure prominently in the collection. The goal of all these tools is to present users with different slices and groupings of the library's Islamic manuscripts, so that they can see the collection at once as a whole and as various interconnected parts. In this way, we aim to take knowledge such as that which Wust possesses, built up through decades of experience, and to present it to the user. Now, certainly, we wish to retain Wust's function as guide, without keeping his role as gatekeeper. In other words, we don't want to in any way limit access to the collection. The whole point of this project, after all, is to be sure that the manuscripts are as widely accessible to as many people around the world as possible. However, the story of Wust's function as custodian and cataloger for so many years, it gives me some pause on this point as well, I have to admit. Wust played such a central role in this collection because true access, in the sense of reading, understanding, and appreciating Islamic manuscripts, demands specialized knowledge and training, which he himself acquired over the course of decades. Is it presumptuous to assume that an untrained user, be it an undergraduate student or a curious member of the general public, will gain anything by being presented with 2,500 digitized manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish? Is it worth the investment in accessibility when we know that the primary audience for this digital repository, and others like it, of course, is a small number of scholars trained in the Islamic sciences? In other words, what's the point of all the bells and whistles when these manuscripts are in truth not really accessible at all? My own feeling is that the answer to this question is yes. Accessibility is worth investing in because, for one reason, one never knows who will be using these manuscripts in the future. It would be presumptuous and damaging to scholars to come to think that precocious amateurs might not make great discoveries or be inspired to become the academicians of the future. We have to consider seriously, though, how we give them our own version of Efraim Wust, a version of the many similar men and women who have guided such collections around the world, to lend them a helping hand. Thank you very much.